My name is Harold Thompson, but everyone around the block calls me Pops. I am 68 years old, and I live in a small house in southwest Atlanta, where the creaking porch and the old oak in the yard have witnessed more years of my life than most folks care to keep. I spent my life driving a delivery truck and fixing what people brought me to fix, a hands-on kind of man who learned to listen more with his eyes than with his ears. Today, I keep a quieter schedule. An early coffee, a slow walk to the mailbox, and afternoons tinkering with radios and old records. But the quiet I found in these last years was the kind of quiet that can hide a storm. I never imagined I would have to press record on my phone in the middle of the night and then hold that little device like it was a weight that could tip the whole world. I said nothing about it for days because I was trying to make sense, and because some truths feel like live coals you fear to touch. I am telling this now because it matters that someone hears what happened, not as gossip, but as a warning about the small things that stack up until they become a mountain you can no longer climb. If you like this kind of honest storytelling, hit like and drop in the comments from which city you are watching me right now. Tell me just one line, your name and where you are, and we will carry each other a little further. The night I pressed record, there was rain on the windows, and the smell of boiled greens still on the stove, and that little domestic combination of ordinary smell and wet glass is the smell that will sit with me forever. I will begin at the beginning, because to understand why I did what I did, you need to know the shape of the house and the way distrust crept in like damp under the floorboards. I was born 5 blocks from where I live now, in a 2-bedroom shotgun house where my mother cooked with a pan that had a blue spot worn down to the metal, and my father whistled when he was worried. My neighborhood then was a patchwork of porches and elders who sat with their cups and told stories that smelled like sweet tea and rust. As a boy, I learned to measure life by the hours of sunlight on the stoop. Mr. Bell taught me to change a tire the summer I was 12, and he was patient and precise and made a game of the work. Mrs. Green taught me to braid hair when I was 15 because her niece had a wedding and they needed hands, and I did not say no to that. Those early years taught me 2 practical lessons. 1, a job done with care is a kindness to the next person who touches it. 2, you pay attention to the small things because small things tell you the truth. My father could not read, but he could tell if a screw did not sit flush by the sound it made. I learned to listen for the difference between a real laugh and one that is trying to cover a hollowness. That listening followed me into adulthood like a scent. It guided how I raised my children and how I built a life that prized steadiness and a few hard rules. I learned, in the language of the old folks, to keep the house in order and to keep the promises you gave. Those promises made me slow to accuse and quick to fix. I fixed broken radios, loose hinges, arguments that could be stitched back together with conversation and patience. I never wanted to be the cause of a storm. Love for me came in a simple package. I met my wife Lillian at a church supper, though we were not particularly religious people. She was handing out plates, and she laughed at something I said about the last piece of peach pie, and that laugh stayed with me for decades. We married young. We built a house with our hands and with the help of Marlon, who lent us tools, and Mrs. Green, who lent us sugar in the lean months. Our first son, Marcus, arrived with a full head of hair and the kind of hunger that made him grow faster than I had expected. Marcus learned to hold a hammer before he learned to tie his shoes, and I was proud in that quiet, internal way that fathers are proud. We taught him about work, about honesty, about the seasons of a life that rewards steady effort. There were nights of joy, too. Aisha was born later when Marcus had a family of his own, and the house grew noisier in the best ways. Jamila, who married Marcus, brought with her a laugh like warm bread and a patience I admired. Our home filled with the smell of baking and baby powder and the noise of toys and bedtime songs. We were not wealthy. We were not perfect. We were enough. Our yard had a shed where I kept an old toolbox and where I taught Marcus to sand and plane and to value the feel of a good wood grain under his palm. That shed carried the sound of our lives like a radio plays a familiar station. We had routines. On Sundays, Marcus and Jamila and Aisha would come over for dinner and laughter. On weekdays, I would call to check in, and Jamila would tell me about the preschool, and Marcus would complain about the truck, and then we would hang up, and it would all feel like a thread connecting us. Years make a place for habits, and also for small distances to creep in. Marcus got a job. That meant later hours and more stress. Jamila took on extra shifts at the clinic because bills did not stop for tiredness. We encouraged them, gave what help we could, but the house that used to house 3 generations of simple dinners began to hold separate rhythms. There were nights Marcus did not stay for dinner. There were mornings when Jamila said she needed to get to the clinic early. The kind of fatigue that builds over years looks like absence. Absence makes room for anxiety, and then for stories you tell yourself to make sense of the space. At first, I dismissed small oddities as the price of busy lives. A missed call would be blamed on work, a text left unanswered because of the clinic. But sometimes the small oddities piled up. A pair of shoes left under the window bed that did not belong to the child. A damp towel in a laundry basket that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though there were no smokers in our family. A bill from a pharmacy for something I had never heard of mailed to their address. When you live a straightforward life, you notice the deviation. I began to mark them in my head like tally marks on a shed wall. Each mark by itself did not mean much. Stacked together, they made me uneasy. The first moment that lodged in my chest like a stone came one sleepy October evening. I arrived with a bag of groceries and found the front door unlocked. The house was dark, but for a kitchen lamp. Aisha's favorite doll was on the table and her little sneakers were near the doorway. Marcus said he had already checked on her, that she was asleep, that he had to head to a night shift because truck work was piling in. His voice was a little too tight, a little too quick. Jamila smiled and made coffee and kept talking about a new patient. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself to mind my own. The next week, there was a note on the family calendar in Marcus' handwriting that said game night changed to late. There were stories from neighbors about Marcus leaving around midnight, the taillights of his truck cutting past the porch. One afternoon, Tanya from 2 doors down, who has a way of watching with a protective, practical attention, stopped me on the stoop and asked if I had noticed Marcus's car in odd places. She liked to gossip in the forgiving way of women who have shared recipes and funerals. She mentioned a time Marcus pulled up near the rec center in the early morning and sat there for a long time. I took these comments like pebbles into my pocket. None of them were a rock. It was the small mechanical things that gave me a plan. Hardware teaches you to set traps that are gentle and precise. I had an old phone that still recorded. I kept it mostly from memories of Lillian who had passed the year before. It felt wrong to put that phone to use in this way, but once the idea lodged, there was no shaking it out. I set the phone to record and left it on the kitchen counter with a clear line of sight to Aisha's bedroom door. I did not tell anyone. I told myself it was to stop the worry that had been pulling at my sleep at night. The first recording was 8 hours of breathy silence. The second one had a small, muffled sound of the baby monitor because Jamila sometimes forgot to switch channels. I rewound those early nights so many times that the house began to feel like a machine that repeated the same parts over and over. Then there came the night of the storm. Rain hit the windows in a way that made the glass tremble, and the streetlight outside splashed the kitchen with a wide, watery light. The storm made the house feel smaller, and my careful plan of observation felt larger than the life it watched. At exactly 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, I heard a faint creak in the recording, a sound I could not ignore because it matched perfectly a footstep I knew. I replayed it 3 times before my heart decided to move. Then came another sound. That sound was the bedroom doorknob turning, then a low voice I would recognize from 1,000 nights. The recording was not cinematic. It was the ordinary capture of things, the hum of the fridge, the occasional car on the distant avenue, and then the footstep and the voice. I listened with a kind of patient hunger. I heard low murmurs and the sound of shoes sliding on a rug. The voice said a few things that I could not at first place. It was Marcus. He was not drunk. He was quiet and careful, and there was a softness to his tone that made me freeze.
He said, "Aisha, baby, it is only me." The child answered with a small sound, not words, the kind of sound a child makes when they are awake but sleepy. Marcus said, "Grandma said to check you, you are hot." I felt my head spin because that was not what Lillian had told me in her last months. Lillian would have saved us from doubt. I continued to listen. Marcus hummed for a moment, and then the sound of fabric. The recording did not contain what I feared in graphic detail. It held a sequence of actions that, placed together, did not sit right. There was a rustle of something cloth-like, a blanket being tucked, then a low thud, as if he moved a chair. There was a whisper that sounded rehearsed. I could not tell whether the whisper was a protective check or searching for comfort that should not have been there. I
rewound, slowed, sped up, and at that late hour I pressed pause, as if stopping the world would let me decide what to do next. I kept that recording inside my chest for 2 days. I played it alone at night and tried to find a plausible explanation that would make the sound safe. Jamila told me on the phone that Aisha had been having bad dreams. Marcus called once and said he had to work late. I would not sleep. I walked around the house with my palms flat on the table and thought of the rules my father taught me about measure and truth. The truth asked for a careful hand. I could not yell without hearing the evidence. I could not accuse without proof. I spoke to Tanya and to Pastor Coleman, who has been a presence in our lives with the sort of gentle counsel older than me that balances judgment with compassion. They did not tell me what to do. They asked how I felt on the recordings, what I believed I had heard. The next night I set 2 recordings because one can fail. I placed one in the hallway and one closer to Aisha's door. I told myself I was guarding my granddaughter's sleep and nothing more. When evidence arrives, it does not always arrive neat. The second night, the phone captured a different texture of sound. Marcus moved differently. He used softer steps. His voice was a shade lower. He said, "Baby girl, sleep now." What followed was a quiet exchange of words I could not fully make out. Something like a small song, a little joke, a phrase he used only with the children when he wanted them calm. Again, there was nothing explicit. But there was the repetition of the same pattern, the same late-night presence, the same voice. I called Jamila at dawn and asked if Aisha had been sick. She said no, that they had a regular evening. Her voice had the tired, clipped quality of someone who had been up the night before and not wanting to be judged. I did not ask directly about the recording, because to do so would be to put accusations into the air. Instead, I asked casually, "Has Marcus been checking on her at night?" She replied, "Sometimes. If the baby cries, Marcus gets up." Why? The why stuck in my throat. I said nothing and hung up. I felt the old rules of our family bending like a tree in a storm. I began to watch more closely the small things that a quick life usually hides. I watched Marcus's truck comings and goings. I paid attention to little details, like the new pair of gloves he had that smelled faintly of something I did not know. And I watched my granddaughter when I could, with attention that felt like a study. At this point, I should tell you exactly how I moved, because I want you to see the care in the way I handled what I thought was wrong, and to understand that anger was not the first thing I chose. I spoke with Dr. Evans at the pediatric clinic in a procedural way about the signs of sleep disturbance and what could be typical for a child. She explained how nurses sometimes advise parents to check on a child if they have a fever or if they have a nightmare, and she told me to document anything that seems out of the ordinary. Documentation matters because memory can soften and evidence can fade. I made copies of the audio files and kept the originals tucked in the phone and put the copies on a small flash drive. I wrote down the dates and times and the sequence in a small notepad I keep by the radio. I told myself to give room for grace, but also to create a chain of custody if needed. That phrase, chain of custody, felt big in my mouth, but I practiced saying it because it gave a kind of calm when chaos rattled. I told Tanya about my recordings in a way that asked for her quiet witness, and she agreed to be with me the next night to check the porch light and the street noise and to be an extra pair of ears if necessary. We agreed to be careful. The night I decided to confront came on a Saturday when the air was cool and the house smelled like roasting corn. I had invited Officer Ramirez, who knows me from when my truck clipped a mailbox years ago, to come by quietly and explain the options for reporting. Ramirez is a man with a straightforward face and a voice that does not flirt with drama. He listened to the short sequence and said we could file a report, or we could try to talk to Marcus directly in a controlled setting. He said that in situations involving family, he had seen confusion delivered like a weapon and clarity delivered like a mirror. I asked him what he would do. He said he would put the concern into a report and step back until the investigation decided the truth. That felt right to me because an investigation gives language and structure to feelings that otherwise become accusations. Before the officers arrived, I set a meeting of family in my living room and invited Marcus and Jamila and a few trusted people, including Pastor Coleman and my old friend Mr. Bell. I did not explain why I had asked them. I wanted the scene to be ordinary and not to tip Marcus off that the recorded evidence existed because I did not want anyone to feel ambushed. When we sat down, the air felt like a held breath. Jamila was already nervous and Marcus was impatient in the way that a man who is proud can be when he feels he is being questioned. I began in the old Baywin way with small talk and coffee until it seemed right to free the knot. I said, "There is something I need to talk about. It is hard to say out loud." Marcus answered brusquely, "Pop, what is this about? I have to be at work." I said, "Sit down for a minute. I will be quick." Marcus sat, but he folded his arms like a gate. I turned the phone on and placed it on the table facing us, finger lightly resting on the play symbol like it was a button that could move time. I told them what I had done, that I had recorded the house the last few nights because I had been worried, and then I played the file. The room was quiet in that way that rooms are when they are waiting for a verdict. The audio played the same 3 a.m. noises and Marcus's voice, then the little sounds of the night. Marcus's face shifted from impatience to confusion to something like hurt. He stood up quickly and said, "How could you do this to me? How could you listen like that?" I answered, "I was listening for my granddaughter." Jamila started to cry, and Pastor Coleman put a hand on my shoulder and said gently that we should breathe and let the facts be heard. Marcus, in the heat of what he felt, said, "This is a violation. You had no right." The exchange spiraled into raised voices and then into pleading. I did not want to fight. I wanted truth. That is why I had copies of the audio and why Officer Ramirez was outside in his car waiting. Marcus tried to explain. He said he had been checking on Aisha because one night she had a fever and had been restless. He said he was tired and that sometimes he stayed until she slept. He said, "I did what any father would do. I stayed in her room and I tried to comfort her. Why are you making this into a thing?" Jamila sobbed and Pastor Coleman put a hand on my shoulder and said gently that we should breathe and let the facts be heard. Marcus, in the heat of what he felt, said, "This is a violation. You had no right." The exchange spiraled into raised voices and then into pleading. I did not want to fight. I wanted truth. That is why I had copies of the audio and why Officer Ramirez was outside in his car waiting. Marcus tried to explain. He said he had been checking on Aisha because one night she had a fever and had been restless. He said he was tired and that sometimes he stayed until she slept. He said, "I did what any father would do. I stayed in her room and I tried to comfort her. Why are you making this into a thing?" Jamila sobbed and said, "You could have told me. You could have told me you were going in." My heart broke in that small domestic way that feels like glass cracking. I asked Marcus plainly why he had lied about being at work late and why he had left the door unlocked. He looked away and the old pride collapsed into a kind of shame. Then a detail came out that unknotted the whole scene. Marcus said, "Last month I had to borrow money from a man at the shop. He comes around sometimes and watches me when I sleep in the truck. I was trying to hide that from Jamila because I thought she would worry." We all listened.
It was a different sort of admission and not the thing my mind had feared. We argued, and then we spoke quietly, and then we let silence enter until it settled. Officer Ramirez stepped in and explained how a formal report would work, and that a neutral investigation could clear up or confirm what the recording suggested. We decided to file an incident report. Marcus protested, but in a way that felt less like denial and more like fear of consequence. The investigation that followed felt like a long, measured work. Ramirez took the copies, cataloged them, and a detective listened in their office room with the kind of professional dispassion that made me proud in a strange way. The house became a scene of paperwork and phone calls and schedules that rearranged all of us. Jamila refused to let their daughter sleep anywhere else for a time. She watched Aisha like she was made of something fragile and precious. We had conversations with Dr. Evans, who asked careful questions about sleeping patterns and dinner times. We had a visit from a social worker who asked in a soft voice about the child's routines and who watched the way Jamila moved when she soothed Aisha. Marcus kept his head down for weeks and went to work in the mornings with a stooped look that was new to him. People in the neighborhood began to look at us with the kind of curiosity that has no compassion at its base. Rumors started to make rounds at the corner store and at the barber shop. I felt the city shrink and the house expand under the weight of everything that was said and unsaid. There were moments of tension across these weeks that seared themselves into my memory. One evening, Marcus came to the door angry and said, "You ruined me." I answered, "I kept my granddaughter safe." He yelled about betrayal, about trust, about living with a label he had not earned yet. For 6 minutes that felt like an hour, we traded words that stung. That was the first moment, I admit, I felt pure fear, not for embarrassment, but for the safety of my family. Another moment came when Jamila would not look at me in the grocery store, and a neighbor, with the best of intentions, said quietly, "Is everything all right?" That small question felt like a needle. The third moment was the night the detective called to say they wanted to speak with Marcus alone, and Marcus refused to go without a lawyer. That refusal did not make him guilty in their language, but in mine, it wanted an explanation. Each of these moments stretched from 5 to 6 minutes of sharp edges, and sitting with that pain taught me how long the heart can hold ache without breaking. Alongside the tension, there were longer conversations that moved us toward repair. I spoke to Marcus in the shed with the toolbox, and we had a long exchange about the way shame can hide the truth more dangerously than honesty. He told me about pressure I had not known, about a man named Clarence who had been pressing him at the shop for late-night favors, about a fear of appearing weak in front of friends. I listened, and then I told him about the blue pan my mother used and how small acts of care made a house steady. That was an awkward conversation with many pauses and hard breaths, but it opened a channel. Jamila and I met with a counselor recommended by Pastor Coleman who worked with families on trauma and boundaries. The counselor asked us to talk not like enemies, but like people trying to make a plan to keep a child safe and to keep a family intact if possible. We wrote rules and we agreed on sleep arrangements. We removed the temptation of nighttime secrecy by installing a simple change. We placed a sensor light outside Aisha's room and asked Marcus to text when he would be up at night for a reason so there would not be surprises. It was imperfect and it was necessary. The official result took its time. Investigators reviewed the recordings, compared them to logs, spoke with neighbors and with Clarence, who denied any wrongdoing but admitted to knowing Marcus. In the end, the formal investigation did not result in criminal charges because the evidence did not show an illegal act in the way the law must see it. But the community consequences were real. Marcus was asked to attend counseling and intervention programs. Jamila considered separation for her and the child's safety, and in private, she said things I was not always ready to hear. We argued long nights about trust and privacy and what it meant to be a family that protects its young. There was also a legal document drawn up that spelled out parenting arrangements for a time and gave Jamila control over nighttime caregiving so that there would be no ambiguity. Legality is a blunt tool. It can shield a child, but it cannot always fix the intimacy of a broken trust. That fix came slowly and with work. The month after the recordings, we sat at the same kitchen table to a different rhythm. We had a family meeting where Marcus and Jamila and I and Pastor Coleman and Dr. Evans sat and asked questions that were careful and practical. Marcus said with a quiet voice that he was ashamed and that he wanted to be better and that he did not expect forgiveness. Jamila said she needed time to see consistent change before she considered rebuilding trust. The second month, Marcus began attending scheduled therapy and a group program at the community center where his supervisor, Clarence, agreed to give him space. He took a job during the day that had more predictable hours. Jamila enrolled Aisha in a daycare that had structured naps and more adult oversight. We established a household log where anyone entering a child's room for a non-emergent reason was to write the time and purpose. The small bureaucracy felt silly at first, but it gave shape to accountability. At 3 months, we had a family barbecue. It was awkward and claustrophobic and also strangely hopeful. Marcus played with Aisha in the yard, tentative at first and then with a cautious warmth. People around us watched. Tanya came and she sat and said, "It is good to see laughter again, but do not let it cover the work." That sentence felt like a reprieve and a command. 6 months later, the house smelled different. The radio in the shed played old songs, and sometimes Marcus would whistle along. We had kept the log, and the changes had become habits. Marcus had a steady job and was attending sessions for anger and boundary work. Jamila and I had a few long conversations about forgiveness and trust that were sometimes gentle and sometimes sharp in the way truth is. The neighborhood still had its eyes, but eyes soften with time if your actions are steady. Aisha was doing better with her sleep. On many nights, she would fall asleep to a song Jamila hums and a small lamp set low. We had moved through something that could have broken the family in irrevocable ways, and instead had chosen a path littered with stubborn repair. Repair is not the same as forgetting. Repair is sitting with the hurt and choosing actions that reflect care. I learned to set my hands to help rather than to hide or to accuse. Marcus slowly learned how to sit with shame and translate it into work. In the quiet moments, I tried to make sense of what had happened in a way that would help someone else. There were technical things I did that I think helped keep us from hurt that could have been worse. I documented everything with timestamps and backups, and I did not act on suspicion without creating a paper trail that investigators could use. I kept the original recordings safe and made copies for anyone who needed to hear them in an official capacity. I wrote dates and small notes about what I had observed and when. I asked for outside counsel early from a doctor and from a police officer who could explain the process. Those steps feel bureaucratic, but they stabilized a situation that could otherwise have become a rumor machine. That is my technical explanation in plain language, and it took only a few minutes of my day for many weeks, but those minutes mattered. I will be blunt and say that if you suspect something, you should keep records and speak with professionals who can translate emotion into action without causing damage. If this part of the story moved you the way it moved me, then I want to ask you a favor. If this part touched you or reminded you of something in your life, please leave a comment below. Just write one line, say once, comma, city, comma, situation, and nothing more. That small act of sharing builds a little map of collective experience, and someone reading might find they are not alone. If you write, you will help others feel less private about their own doubts and less alone in their fears. Thank you for that. Now, if you will, stay with me, because after that, I want to tell you about the quiet work of rebuilding and why I would do the strange and painful thing of recording my own family again if I had to. Today, a year on, the house is different, and so am I. I am still Pops, the same name, the same stoop, but I carry a new carefulness in my chest. Marcus and Jamila attend counseling together when they can and separately when needed. There are still days when Jamila moves through the house with the guardedness of someone who has survived a storm. There are still nights when I check in with a message and wait for a reply. Aisha runs in the yard with a friend's child, and she tugs at my hand to lift her. She asks for pancakes on Saturday and a story about the old radio. We tell stories again in a way that sits next to the other stories and does not erase them. I learned that family can survive a fracture if we are willing to let outside hands help mend it, and if we are honest about the work that repair requires. If you are watching this and you are thinking of doing something similar, here are a few practical things I want to leave you with that came from the months afterward. Keep careful records. If you hear things that make you uneasy, write down dates, times, and what you recall. Back up evidence and do not rely on memory alone. Consult a professional early so that your concerns are addressed by those who can make a formal assessment. Try to avoid going straight to confrontation in a way that will only create more chaos. You can ask for an investigation or mediation that gives structure. Most importantly, think of the child if a child is involved. Their safety and stability should be the guiding star. That is not always easy because love and fear make choices messy. But making deliberate, documented, and compassionate choices keeps us from acting out of panic. As we close, I want to say plainly that this experience changed the way I see trust and the way I choose to act on suspicion. There is a difference between protecting and punishing, and between accusation and investigation. I learned to put processes in place to guard the vulnerable and not to let rumor be the decision maker. I found later that some people in our circle were angry with me for recording, but some of those people came to understand that my intention was to protect a child I loved. In the end, the law did not have to decide guilt in our case, but it offered a framework to sort our human mess into something a little more manageable.
If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. I plan to share more stories, not to sensationalize, but to speak plainly about how ordinary people face extraordinary moments. If you have been through something similar, share one line in the comments. If you have advice about how to handle these moments with compassion and accountability, please share it too. We make fewer mistakes when we learn from one another. Thank you for listening. One last thing I want you to take with you is this small line I tell myself when I wake up in the dark, worried about what the day may bring. The line is simple, and it has kept me steady. It is this, spoken slow so it can be true in the body. We are allowed to be hurt and to be brave at the same time.